Hi, and welcome to Power of 10, a podcast about design operating at many levels, zooming out from thoughtful detail through to organisational transformation and onto the changes in society and the world. My name is Andy Polaine. I'm a service design and innovation consultant, coach, trainer, and writer. I've always wanted Power of 10 to be more than just me talking to designers talking about design. It's an enormous treat and an honour for me to have as my guest today Dr. James Hollis, a Washington D.C. based Jungian psychoanalyst and the author of 16 books which have been translated into 19 languages and whose wisdom I draw heavily upon in my coaching work. Dr. Hollis taught humanities for 26 years in various colleges and universities before retraining as a Jungian analyst at the Jung Institute of Zurich, Switzerland. He served as Executive Director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston for many years and was Executive Director of the Jung Society of Washington until 2019, where he now still serves on the Board of Directors. Additionally, he's a Professor of Jungian Studies for Saybrook University of San Francisco and Houston. And that barely scratches the surface of a well-examined life most certainly lived with meaning. James, welcome to Power of 10.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I realised when I was researching this episode that I thought I'd read most of your books. And then as I started to go through, I thought, oh no, hang on a second, 16 books. You've been extremely prolific over many years. And so this could be a complete series in its own right. And I have so many questions, it's hard to know where to start. But I thought I would start with the world of work. Partly because that's, a lot of the stuff I do in coaching, of course, but also it's recently been thrown upside down. I wrote a little kind of rant, it was on LinkedIn the other day about how the work should not be miserable, by which I meant not, unpleasant occasionally and not difficult sometimes, but miserable is its own sort of special thing. It's a sort of ongoing drain. In your book, The Eden Project, In Search of the Magical Other, there's a chapter in it on eros in the organization that's really stuck with me over the years. And you talk about this kind of paternal dynamic that is set up in work. And I wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit about this idea where you, if I quote you said, most people experience their work environments as a society and not a community and suffer from the difference. What did you mean by that? And maybe you could kind of unpack that a little bit for us.
Certainly. Well, society is an arrangement of people and their energies to address a certain subject, like improving our crops or improve our water supply. And as long as that purpose is served or failed to be served, the society will disintegrate because it has no further reason for being. It's a kind of horizontal organization. But a community is an organization that has a vertical dimension to it. So when that occurs, each person feels part of something larger and is partly defined by that. So societies are pretty fragile and easily sort of dispersed. Communities have the capacity to persist. So religious communities through the years, for example, have sometimes been able to survive enormous migration, persecution, and so forth, as we know, because they had some sort of vertical identification, something larger than their own individual journeys and their common purpose, but some relationship to some transcendent value of some kind. And too often at work, as we know, it's all about the bottom line and producing as many of the widgets as possible. And no one's particularly going to get excited about that. So it's kind of hard to sustain community at a work environment, but it's certainly a possible goal, I should say.
This idea of the kind of paternal dynamic, I've definitely seen where there's this kind of, I think you talk about it in the book as well, actually, where this idea that, workplace organizations kind of ask their employees to love them, but it's impossible for them to be loved back. And there's a kind of dynamic that gets set up that is possibly quite unhealthy. And when people get suddenly fired, like many have been during the pandemic, it's not just, I've just lost my job, I've just been fired. It's kind of a rejection from the parent too.
Sure.
Is that your kind of reading of that, or have I understood that wrong?
Correct, because we always carry with us our emotional needs, and the person doesn't check that at the front door of the office. He or she brings into that environment all of his or her psychology. And that includes those parental needs. So it works out in various ways. If there has been a kind of positive parental experience, one is looking to the corporation to be the good parent. So how dare they lay me off, for example? Why don't they understand my emotional needs? Why does this get sacrificed? And on the other hand, you can have a sense of opposition, a negativity toward the organization, up to and including something like industrial sabotage, or people deliberately not carrying through on their assignments because they're still reacting against some kind of internalized authority figure. So we don't check our psychological history at the front door. We carry it everywhere we go. So it's bound to be triggered. I had a friend years ago who was a personnel director, HR director of a major British corporation here in the United States. And he gave a speech typically to the new employees. And he said basically, and he was a very thoughtful, humane person. He said, I want you to know the corporation does not love you. They will rent your behavior as long as it's productive for the corporation. And they will cease to rent it on the day that it's no longer productive. Now, that's kind of a bucket of cold water in one's face.
I can imagine.
But he went on to say, therefore, your sense of value here, apart from a paycheck, which in the long run, they'll never pay you enough for whatever it might cost your soul. Your value here was your inherent sort of interest in your work and your camaraderie with friends. And if you don't have that, it's going to be miserable indeed. And believe it or not, his whole motive was humane. He was trying to help people recognize what projections they were going to bring to the corporate environment and expectations that inevitably would have been frustrated.
Yeah. I feel like, most people probably understand the concept of projection. People certainly use it all the time. It's one of those things that's kind of entered sort of common parlance of, you're just projecting your whatever on me. Yeah. I wonder if it's kind of understood in its nuance. Would you sort of talk about what projection actually is? Because the Eden Project's largely about that, right? In terms of relationships all over.
Well, we don't have projections consciously. We don't wake in the morning and say, well, today I'm going to have a projection before 10 a.m. A projection means something in my psyche has been triggered. It's activated an energy that has the power to leave me and go out into the world. Now, I don't know that that's happened, but I start seeing the world through the lens of that projection. In other words, let's say two people meet. Are they friends or foes? Is this going to develop into a romantic relationship? Is it going to be hostile? They bring their history into that engagement. And in that moment, each is projecting on the other person. The second stage of this is the other person, because they're other, won't fully conform to the sort of gestalt or expectations of that projection. So it produces some cognitive dissonance or discrepancy. That often leads to a little confusion, maybe the power complex. It says, well, let me move you back into place here. Let me just try to get you back to what I thought you were. And fourth, invariably, over time is the erosion of the projection, and it falls back into the unconscious. And since I don't know that's what I was doing, I'm literally unconscious that that's happened. So there's a good chance to blame you for what happened, for example. And that's usually where things end, with disappointment, disillusionment, sometimes anger and bitterness. The fifth stage, if it's going to happen, is a person could recognize, what did I put out on you? What was I expecting from the corporation? What was I expecting from this affiliation? And now that energy has come back to me. And what am I going to do with that? That's the key.
So there's that sort of classic thing of you wake up one day and in the middle of a row with your partner, you're not the person I married, right? Because they're not, right? You married your projection, which also seems to happen a lot. I guess that moment happens a lot more in work, because most people probably swap their jobs more often than they swap their long-term relationships. And so there's this place isn't like it used to be when I joined and so forth. And I'm guessing some of that is the projection that falls away. But some of it is, of course, that everything is constantly evolving and things do change. During the pandemic, it strikes me that, and certainly many of the conversations I've had on with guests as well, it gave everyone kind of pause for thought to think about. It's almost like a lot of that got stripped away, perhaps, or the projection got shifted in some way, or people had pause to experience kind of life outside of work. And that when people are very, very busy, it's almost one of the kind of myths of productivity is when they're very, very busy, they sort of end up in a kind of drift.
Mhm.
Where the weeks and the years go by, and then suddenly they're in a place that they didn't mean to, which we'll come to. But have you kind of experienced that? I mean, in your practice, in your analysis with patients, have you seen? What are your thoughts about kind of that shift that's happened during the pandemic?
Well, certainly the enforced sequestering that we've been obliged to go through has required, I think, some severing of what I'll call the plug-ins. And what I mean by that, many people are learning. I didn't know how much of my identity, my script, my set of values, my behavioral agenda were these plugins, such as getting up in the morning, going to work. And what if you can't do that? What if your work is closed, or what if it's constrained in a significant way? Well, those loose ends now often are dangling out there with some anxiety at the end of each one of them. And, that's one of the things that is happening during our pandemic. A lot of people are being introduced to a new relationship to themselves. And they're not very happy with the company there, because
Okay.
it's easy to avoid that kind of meeting because we have
Right.
a world of distraction 24/7. It's not just work, it's popular culture. Blaise Pascal in the 17th century said, the biggest human problem of all is the inability of a person to sit by himself in his own private chamber, which is an extraordinary sentence in the 17th century.
Yeah.
But now, if you take away people's electronic gadgetry and all of the things that we have to distract us, then you have to sort of say, but who am I and what am I going to do? And it's been a kind of inversion of all those projections we were just talking about. And some people have found new interests and new talents and so forth. I know a lot of people who are grateful now to be working from home and not having to spend time commuting to work and finding parking places and that sort of thing. And other people feel very much adrift and anxious.
Yeah. Work can also feel like a very worthy distraction, right? It's probably one of the easiest things that's very drummed into us as well. I'd say particularly in the States as well, the kind of Protestant work ethic or Calvinist work ethic, that this idea that you can very strongly rationalize the reason why you should be kind of doing it and focusing on it. And yet, when I was talking about people, I come across people, there really is some misery at work, and it's kind of long term, and it really feels like this dissonance between that inner acknowledgement that people really know that they should be doing something else and actually what they're doing. And it's heavily laced with fear, it seems to me.
Of course. Well, there's a huge difference between work and vocation, after all. Work, what we do theoretically to put food on our table, and that's certainly existentially relevant. Vocation is whatever you call to do with your life. It comes from vocatus, vocal. What are you called to do with your life? That's quite different. Now, you can do your day job and still have your life outside of that, and some people flourish in that way. I had a client years ago who had a master's degree in philosophy. And there's not too great a call for philosophers these days, you may have noticed. So what he did was he delivered an area newspaper, 4 different routes in the morning. And he said, when everyone else is headed off to work, depressed, he said, at 7:30 in the morning, I'm free. And he spent his life enjoying his hobbies and going to university and taking courses and so forth. In other words, he was able to split in a conscious way and say, this is how I pay my bills. And here's how I feed my soul. And one ultimately has to feed the soul, or something will grow sour and pathologize within us. That's why we can get all that we want in life and still feel an inner emptiness, or even a kind of reactive depression. Because our human psyche has a life of its own and an autonomy. And it's never silent. It's always manifesting its qualitative analysis of how our life is going or not going.
Yeah. There's also that whole culture. It sort of came out. I don't know if it's entirely come out of Silicon Valley. I see it a lot from the US of this idea of the side hustle. So everyone's an entrepreneur and just kind of adds to yet another distraction and another stress. And in some respects, kind of is wanting to have your cake and eat it, right? Wanting to be able to have the kind of vocational thing, but then not have the pain, I guess, of leaving the secure parental job, right? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So I'm really fascinated. I normally sort of do a kind of little recap of people's kind of, or get people to talk about their pathway here. Talking of that kind of shift in careers, you were teaching for a very long time, and you worked in academia for a very long time. Can I ask you, what was I mean, you talk about it somewhat in Living Between Worlds, actually. What was the shift for you, or where was the sort of moment where you thought this is not for me, or there's this other thing?
Well, the one thing I've always identified with and still enjoy and consider my prime vocation, which is teaching in various forms, as speaking with you, writing, talking with clients, and so forth. And in my early life, I was a tenured professor of humanities at a university. And I enjoyed the job very much. I love working with the students and so forth. But at midlife, I found myself in a depression. Midway in life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood, as Dante said. And it's the first time I ever stopped to sort of examine my goals. And I realized I'd achieved all my goals. I had a doctorate by the time I was 27. I had a lovely family. I had a career that I valued. I mean, what could go wrong here?
Yeah,
and yet the psyche itself was protesting from within. And so it sent me to my first hours of therapy, not thinking at the moment, oh, I'm starting the second half of life, the one where I sort of get myself back again. Because little did I know that the degree to which I had, as most of us do, invested in what I thought were the appropriate goals in life, what the sort of scripts all around us tell us to do with our lives. And it wasn't teaching that was the problem. There was something in me that was wanting to go deeper. And when I started the process, it wasn't about changing my career. It was more about, why am I, feeling so bad? Why is the psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the places where I want to put it? The executive suite up here and the brain is saying, here's what you do. You build a career, you get tenure, you get promotion, et cetera, et cetera. And something inside is in revolt. So go figure that one out. And I think that happens in most people's life, not everyone's, but most people's life. And the key is, all right, what does that then call me to consider? Where do I need to sort of go back to the drawing board and be accountable for that? So it was a several-year transition, and it led me to travel to Switzerland and retrain in analytic psychology. And so I continued the good part, which is the teaching, but I left the bureaucracy. And,
I can sympathize.
Yeah. And since then, I've been basically a free agent. And what was interesting to me is when I left a tenured position, most of my colleagues thought I'd lost my mind, because that was one of the goals. That was a lifetime job, and a good job, and security and benefits and a fairly easy schedule compared to most.
Mm.
And I walked away from that. And I had to suddenly pay my own insurance. I had to suddenly generate my own clients. The university wasn't doing it for me. I had to find my own office and pay for it, et cetera. And it was, in one level, psychologically shocking. But the truth is, I never looked back. I felt from the beginning the rightness of it. Because if we're doing what's right for us, something inside supports us. You can be scared out of your mind, and that's okay. But if you're doing what's right for you, something inside supports you. And if you're doing what's wrong, it'll oppose you. And we don't always trust that, but that's an important thing to recognize.
Can I ask actually just quickly, how old were you roughly then?
Well, when I first started my own therapy and began to look into these things, I was 35, right on schedule. It was almost planned, as it were, assuming the usual 70 years. And it was about a 6-7 year process of transition. Right. And about halfway through there, I left the university and moved into therapy, and have been doing that ever since.
And so can I also ask, I know it's very personal, but I kind of, to match it to where I see a lot of other people, were you married and had kids at that point in time? Or so all the kind of trappings of responsibility and everything. So hence the tenure where, you've got to that final, you got to the bit where you've got a job for life, right? You're finally kind of, fully docked to the parental organization. You made the break. Going back to that thing where you said I was scared of hell, but it kind of felt like the right thing to do. I felt I needed to do this as well. It's quite hard sometimes to differentiate between those two. And, you've written many, many books about this moment in life, the middle passage. And actually in your most recent book, Living Between Worlds, it sounded to me like your time in Zurich was a very special and very kind of made a massive impact on you, not just because of the training. It felt like it was a kind of very important time in your life. How did you, and how do we differentiate between the kind of anxiety of giving things up and the sort of anxiety of I'm not doing the right thing if I don't give those things up and start something new?
Well, for one thing, we're never free of anxiety. People can be anxious about being anxious, or they can be depressed about being depressed, literally, not knowing that those are normal human conditions. A certain measure of depression, pockets of depression is what I would call it. I'm not saying where you're so depressed you can't get out of bed. But pockets of depression rise out of the fact that your full life is being frustrated in various ways and so forth, and it's an appropriate reaction. Anxiety comes with being human. The key is, what does that make you do, or what does that keep you from doing? That's the key. In other words, being anxious, being uncertain, having doubt, that's human. But then does that shut you down? Because and this is going to sound very much like a cliche, but if at the end of your life, you look back at your life and you say, did I live my journey? Or did I constantly come up to the precipice of choice and then steer away? And something in us knows the difference. And that's, as Sartre said, mauvais foi versus bonne foi. Are you living in good faith with your own soul? Because in the end, your soul, and I'm using that in the sense of the Greek word psyche, and that is to say who you most deeply are, it knows what's right for you, and it's not particularly interested in your comfort or fitting in, you see. The people that we would admire most in history, stop and think whom you admire in history. And in many cases, their lives were very conflictual, full of suffering, often without recognition in their lifetime. And yet we admire them because they embodied something that was meant to be embodied in this world. It wasn't about their egos. It wasn't about their fiscal plan. It was about being in service to something that mattered within them. And that's what vocation really is here.
Yeah.
And when you do that, something supports you. That's the whole point. There's a big difference, for example, between happiness and meaning. We're told to pursue happiness as if it's an achievable goal. Happiness, as you know, is very transient, very contextual, and can be delusional. And meaning is something that abides. For example, as a therapist, it doesn't make me happy to spend 8 hours a day listening to people suffering, but it is profoundly meaningful. There's a difference, and I know the difference. If it weren't meaningful, I'd be doing something else. I'd be driving trucks, or I'd do something else. It's meaningful in ways in which your psyche makes that judgment, not your income, and not your peers, and not your resume.
In my work when I'm coaching, and I mentioned just before we're recording, there's a lot of. I think this is probably true of other professions. I think it's true in many, if not all, actually, but certainly in things like engineering and medicine and things. But designers have, and people in sort of creative industries, have often made a decision kind of against the parental scripts or the scripts of teachers around them to take on a vocation, actually, of some kind of creative calling already. And my theory about this really is that they then start to lean very heavily into their craft because it's a very visible, way of showing that they are achieving and they're doing something that other people can't. It might be something like being able to draw, and people look at that and go, so it's really great that you can draw like that. I couldn't do that. And there's a sort of comfort that comes with that. And then they sort of start to very heavily identify with their craft. And as they move into more leadership roles where they actually have to start sort of getting off with the tools and they're starting to lead people, and actually their medium sort of becomes the team and the team of people and the people who they're leading. There's this, what I've called the design leadership dip, where they're kind of not very good at their tools and also not very good at the leadership role, because that leadership role is also about becoming more authentically them. And if they don't, they sort of often become, at best, not a very good leader, and at worst, they become kind of horrible, draconian dictator. It seems that it's a lot harder to let go than it is to kind of build stuff up. We're talking about the second half of life and the middle passage. Can you describe what you mean by, and what Carl Jung meant by the first and second half of life?
Sure. Before I do that, let me just comment there. There was a book back in the 60s by Lawrence J. Peter called The Peter Principle. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
But basically what he said, if you do your job well, somebody's going to notice, and they're going to think, oh, well, that's the person who should supervise the others and, promote the same kind of productivity with them. And what it does is promote you away from your love, promote you away from yourself. Yeah. And sooner or later, you're filling out budget requests, and having committee meetings and that kind of thing. So it promotes the person to the level of his or her incompetence. Yeah. And most of all, it separates them from who they are. Now,
and there's a lot of misery there, right?
A lot of misery there. Exactly right. Yes. Because remember, paycheck's supposed to cover all of this. Well, we all know better than that. If you're put in a job that is thoroughly miserable and you're given £1 million a day or €1 million, and you'd say in a short time, they're not paying me enough for this job, right? Yeah, because there's something else inside that's in revolt. Now, in terms of the passage, when I came back from Zurich and started seeing people in the United States, and they would come with different life stories, different biographical settings, et cetera, different presenting issues. One thing that was clear for virtually every one of them was that their understanding of self and world was no longer working for them. Their roadmap was no longer applicable to the territory they were in. Something had played out because, no one would go to a total stranger, talk about your intimate life, pay them money, unless you tried very hard to make your own systems work for you, which is typically a way of reinforcing whatever your script was and digging whatever that hole is deeper and deeper and deeper. It's usually because people are feeling an enormous sense of frustration, maybe depression, maybe they've been self-medicating, whatever it is, a kind of sort of dead end that leads one to bring this to a stranger, as I said. So I thought, well, the obvious thing here is something is dying. And something wants to live, something wants to be emerging in the world through that person, but we have no idea what it is. And now we're in that in-between. And it could be a terrible in-between. It's a time of unknowing, a time in which marriages fall apart, where careers fall apart, where one no longer is able to take pleasure in what formerly worked. And part of the role of therapy is to hold together the fragments during that disintegration period until something else emerges. Because there's a paradox here. We tend to walk down the street backwards, metaphorically. We're always looking at the future in terms of what our experience has been. And that's understandable because we can build on that experience. Mm-hmm. The problem is that experience is not necessarily germane to where we're going. And if you walk down the street backwards, who knows what you fall into? But the future is just as real as anything that's ever happened. But it's so amorphous, so unknown, people don't realize that, which is another reason why we cling to the thing we have known, whether it's a relationship, a career, or a lifestyle, or whatever it is. So what had occurred to me then at the time, this is a passage that occurs for most people, not all of them, most people, somewhere around midlife, although it can happen later. And I'll give you an example in a moment. And when we talk about it as midlife, what are we talking about? Well, by the time you're mid-30s, as I was, or 40, two things have happened. One, you've gained enough ego strength to bear looking at yourself. A young person can be very thoughtful and very intentional, but they can't really bear to look at all of the things that need to be looked at. So you need to have enough ego strength and development. You need to have a sense of failure, which is what brings you a sense of urgency around this. And you need to have some life to reflect upon. Because a 20-year-old still thinks, at some level, I won't repeat the mistakes of my parents. I'll go out and find the right person to marry. I'll go out and find the right career. And by 40, I'm going to be where I want to be. Well,
and live forever, right?
And live forever. I'm immortal on top of that, yes. And good luck with that, right? And that's one of the things I felt in teaching at the university, with all due respect to the students, is, I was talking 20-year-olds, and I thought if we were 40, we would have a different conversation going on here. That was their fault. That was my issue. And that's one reason I thought, well, I'm going to go have adult conversations around these matters. So this is not confined to midlife. It's just that often it takes a while for our understandings of self and will to play out. But people hit it when they face aging, illness, or divorce, or downsizing, or retirement, or the hint of mortality, and so forth. Anything that causes a person to very radically go back and say, now, who am I apart from my roles? Which may be good roles or bad, but who am I apart from that? Who am I apart from my scripts? Who am I apart from my history? Who am I apart from my relationships? In other words, it brings about the possibility of a deeper existential question. What is my life journey about? Not just defined by social and economic and relational pressures around me. And that's where you have an invitation to sort of recover a deeper relationship to yourself. Another way of putting this is, in the first half of life, what we have to do is address what I'll call social questions. Can I develop enough ego strength to deal with my parents, meet their expectations, to deal with a school teacher, to deal with peers, to deal with a potential partner, to deal with an employer? And all of that is ego formation. And, when our bodies get big and our roles get big, we think, well, I'm a big person now. Little knowing what kinds of tapes we're playing inside. Are we repeating? Are we running from? Or trying to fix something unconsciously? And then in the second half of life, the real project is that ego consciousness has to confront the inner life. That is to say, confront the soul in the deepest sense of that word. Who am I apart from all that? And what's my journey about? What's wanting to enter the world through me? That's a different kind of question. Yeah. So the second half of life is really a psychological question, maybe a spiritual question, because it has to do with finding our fundamental values and recovering a personal authority. You could be boss of a corporation, but be psychologically bound to a complex and never know that's what you're really serving.
Yeah.
And what is worthy of your service is really a question of the second half of life.
You describe, and I think Jung did too, of the first half of life being a kind of a mess, a kind of an accident, or a whole set of mistakes that you spend the second half of life trying to kind of work your way out of.
Yeah, it's a gigantic, unavoidable mistake. And parents often say to me with good intention, how do I spare my children this? The answer is you can't. If they follow your script, they're going to maybe turn out like you, but that's not who they are. They have a different journey. And you have to go out and hit a wall before you begin to get conscious here.
Yeah.
That's exactly what happened to me, of course. As I said, I had achieved everything I wanted, and yet the inner life deserted me. So then I had a real paradox.
Yeah. And you describe this middle passage also as the swamp lens. You've write about it in several books, but obviously the book called Swamp Lens of the Soul too. Mm-hmm. There's a bit in the middle passage that where you say, we may become strangers to those who thought they knew us, but at least we're no longer strangers to ourselves. As you come to understand who you are, obviously, and change those scripts and no longer repeat those tapes and respond to those kind of projections. Obviously, people around you are suddenly again, you're not the person I thought you were, and that can break friendships and relationships and all sorts of things. It's it's quite a lonely place to be. I mean, I can, report myself. I know this is definitely, and I've seen it in others, it can be quite a lonely place to be. Yeah. And yet you make the difference in Living Between Worlds about loneliness versus solitude. Mm-hmm. Maybe you could, what is the difference?
Well, we all have a terror of loneliness because we are social animals. And some part of us feels, I can't survive without the presence of the other. And there's a half-truth there. On the other hand, nature has equipped all of us with resources. In other words, why should I think I don't have the resources of my ancestors to survive and to move on and find resilience and so forth? But on the other hand, people will avoid that kind of meeting with themselves. You see, in solitude, you're present to yourself. There's a relationship. In other words, when you have a relationship to yourself, there's always a conversation going on. You're never fully alone. That's why there's an old saying, the cure for loneliness is solitude, which sounds, truly paradoxical, but it's true because that means that I have a kind of ongoing relationship to a conversation, if you will, about what is this journey about and what's unfolding here and what do I need to address? And this other question, what wants to enter the world through me? Because in the first half of life, as I suggested, it's always about what does the world want from me? That's a social question. I've got to deal with out there. Well, when we start dealing with in here, then you have a different question. What wants to enter the world through me? I said a moment ago, we're always in service to something. You better figure out what it is. Because if you're in service to the primal complexes, which is to say the clusters of history that fate presented us, it's always going to be in some way someone else's life, someone else's agenda. It's going to be regressive in character. If you're in service to what wants to enter the world through me, then again, it doesn't bring about necessarily a comfortable life, but it brings about a more meaningful life. And that's the payoff here.
You talk about, talking of sort of life, you talk about in Living Between Worlds, you describe very clearly, I think, the three essential principles of depth psychology. And then I was thinking, well, this is kind of really also obviously the three essential principles for life. Or the first one, so they are, it's not about what it's about. What you see is compensation for what you don't see, and all is metaphor. It felt like to me, actually, as I was thinking about this just now, that it's not what it's about. It's kind of like an overarching one that almost contains the other two in many respects, if all is metaphor, mm-hmm. and what you see is compensation for what you don't see. What did you mean by it's not about what it's about? Because it's, I think, a kind of, so again, it's one of those nice paradoxes that unpacks a whole load.
Sure. Well, first of all, speaking as a therapist, when a person brings in a depression, what they want is the relief of the symptoms of that depression.
Yeah.
Or they want to work on their marriage or whatever the presenting issue. But it's not about that, ultimately. It's about who were you that entered into this situation? What did you bring to the table there? What is activated in you? And if we don't look at that, we're just going to be tinkering with the outer circumstances. That's why so much modern psychology and pop psychology is superficial, because it's tinkering with outer structure. But secondly, looking at it intrapsychically, if I accept the scripts that my family of origin and my culture give me, then I'm going to serve them and life's going to work out, which is exactly what I did and most of us do in good faith. Mm-hmm. And that's why I had such curiosity at midlife to have a depression. If I've done the right things, why is this inner division so pronounced at this moment? So if you say it's not about what it's about, well, it's about something else. Now, let me just mention here, the word psyche is the Greek word for soul. Therapy means to listen to or attend to. Mm. So you don't have to be in therapy with a therapist to listen to your own soul. It means paying attention. What's going on here? Asking some very pragmatic questions of any behavior that we do. But what was that in service to inside of me really? Really? In other words, I might do a good thing as I understand it, or as I was conditioned. Maybe it's a codependent thing. Maybe it's a fear-driven thing. Maybe it's a thing that says adaptation at all costs. If I really ask, what was that really in service to? then I'm beginning to deal with what it's really about. Now, that's why behaviorism is so limited and much cognitive psychology.
Yeah.
They have uses. They're useful. I'm not dismissing them. I'm just saying that many times they don't get to the real issue. And that is, we are creatures of infinite adaptation. And with every adaptation, there's the possibility of further estrangement from the depths and purposes of our own soul.
It's hard for me not to connect loads of little patterns in my head that going back to design, for example, one of the things that designers pride themselves on is trying to see the problem behind the problem, or the real problem space behind the brief, or when they're interviewing people, when we do contextual interviews or ethnographic interviews where we go to people and ask, in their workplace or in their houses and get them to show us a thing that we're working on. There's this classic method called the 5 whys where, someone says, well, what I really want is X. And you say, well, why do you want that? And they go, why? Because of this. And then you gradually get down to the problem space, or you kind of ladder it up to a kind of a broader thing. So the most famous ones, people don't want a drill, they want a hole in the wall. And actually they want a hole in the wall because they want to hang pictures up. And then it's not that they want to hang pictures up, it's they want to make their office feel more homely and so forth. Right? So you kind of move up there. As you were describing, just now, that kind of process, I'm doing all the right things and yet something feels wrong. It also reminds me how many organizations and many companies end up in that place where it feels like we're doing all the right things, but somehow this doesn't kind of really work. And it feels like that, the being true to their purpose and meaning, which is often lost. I mean, the founders of those companies are often long gone, or if not, then if it's not from decades ago or centuries ago, in some cases, it's certainly some of those founders have kind of lost their way. They kind of lose their purpose and meaning. I kind of wanted to zoom up one more level it's hard to ignore where we are now and what's going on in society. And it feels like we're living through this terribly turbulent time, and it's a kind of tipping point, and it's and yet there's part of me that kind of also feels like, well, it was ever thus. And in your book, you said, you say in Living Between Worlds, you say, why should we believe that our lives should be any different, or our pathway should be any easier than those that have gone before us? What is your view on where we're at the moment? Because it does feel like we're a cultural moment of change. Is it just one blip in the rest of the kind of history of the world, or do you feel something different going on?
Well, there are several questions there. Let me just mention a moment.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. One point you made as once, usually corporations and institutions are founded with a vision and a passion by somebody. And the purpose then is, how do we transmit this to the next generation? How do we sustain this? How do we enlarge it? How do we broaden its impact? That's when something gets institutionalized. And then you start falling into the pathology of institution, whereby two things happen. The institution over time evolves into preserving itself at almost any cost, right? Even at the risk of violating its original principles. And secondly, it tends to develop a priesthood of some kind, an executive class that often seeks to sustain its own privileges and so forth, no matter whether it's in academia, the religious organizations, universities, government, whatever. So that's why, institutions are both necessary at one level and pathologized at the other level. And that's why they need renewal from time to time. They need critics, they need rebels. Now, in terms of where we are, we're always in between to some degree. I'm always drawn to Matthew Arnold's lines from the 1860s. He said, "We wander between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born." Now, what I think he was referencing, particularly at that point, is that traditional religion, which had animated and guided his father's life so profoundly, Thomas Arnold, headmaster at Rugby School, was no longer acceptable to him. He could no longer believe those things. And he knew that there was some profound transition going on. It's been going on to some degree for centuries, but I think at the heart of it, what's happening is the sort of loss of received authority, first of all, from tribal mythology that was replaced by large institutions like church and
Yeah.
government and so forth,
Mhm.
and the erosion of those authorities, and therefore the task of meaning falls back upon the shoulders of the individual. Carl Jung put it once in a letter. He said, the modern fell off the roof of the medieval cathedral into the abyss itself, you see. And with
Yeah.
that, you have an existential terror. It's like, oh my goodness, this is too much to handle. So you create a culture of distraction, divertissement, as Pascal called it. You create a world of fundamentalism. Let's go back and renew the world that we knew at any cost, because there's a certain security in the known, and let's anesthetize or divert ourselves, and that's what happens. And for some people, this is a profound dignity and invitation to say, all right, now meaning has shifted from the group to you. How are you going to deal with that? That's the telling question in your life. Now, I think it's also true in this moment. This is when you talk about tipping point. Well, we don't know where that's headed, of course.
Yeah.
For one thing, I think we have seen, to our dismay, some of our naivete has been washed away, I suspect, in terms of the powers of government and the powers of our institutions and the powers of our scientific instrumentalities, including medicine, to solve our problems. There's a certain naivete that says, well, our experts will just swoop in there and solve the problem. Well, we see how well or poorly that's been managed, particularly in this country. And that's one thing. But I think, there are other shifts going on. The movement, for example, that occurred from the land to the cities, from the land to and handcrafting to machines and so forth. Those are huge shifts in a culture.
Mm.
Well, as we well know, we're shifting to goods and services, and most of all, information technology. And as they say, who controls the information will control the world. Now, we are at some level being tracked by, I'm not being paranoid here, this is widely known, it's in the newspaper.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Whenever you use your phone, that's part of national data, and it's being observed by governments, et cetera, and your tastes, your politics, and so forth. And some studies have indicated, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's something like this. If someone has 250 pieces of data about you, they know you better than your parents know you. And if they have 400 or 500 pieces of data about you, which is easily accessible by way of electronic observation, they know you better than your partner does. Now, that says something about the power to track people, to control them, and to influence them in various ways. So, for all of this progress, there's always a dark side. It's always been the case that wherever you make a leap forward, the shadow follows. I mean, I think the first great work of modern depth psychology was Dostoevsky's work, Notes from Underground, in which he's talking about the famous Crystal Palace outside of London and this parade of self-congratulations in 1851, the new technology. And he said, I can imagine in the next century that technology will be used to kill more people more efficiently, which was exactly the case.
Exactly the case.
And about 60 years later, you have the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 British casualties in 24 hours, so much the wonders of technology. So there's always a shadow side to progress, and no one knows where we're going. Anyone who says they do is simply delusional, on my view. But and nobody's particularly in charge, which is pretty scary. And would you trust somebody who's in charge anyhow? So I do think we are in some tipping points now, but I'm not prepared to speculate as to where that's going. What I can say is it becomes more and more incumbent upon each of us to have a sense of our own inner compass, so to speak. In 1862, the American poet Emily Dickinson said once, "The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can." And I think she was recognizing this erosion of institutional authority. And she was saying, you better have a compass. And that compass better be inside. And do you know you have that compass? Can you trust it? And do you have enough courage to live that? And if you do, it'll help you chart your course through this evolving time.
So one of the things you say very towards the end, actually, of Living Between Worlds is our best, most demanding and most useful job is addressing our own shadows. And you talked about the shadow just now. Mm-hmm. It's a concept, maybe you could explain a little, but one of the things I think it's often viewed as just all the kind of evil stuff. Mm-hmm. But it's not just that either.
No, not at all. The shadow was Jung's term for those parts of myself or my affiliation, such as a marriage or an institutional affiliation, that when I bring it to consciousness, I find inconsistent with my intentions or troubling or perhaps too challenging for me. So, for example, none of us want to look at ourselves at our jealousies, at our pettiness, at our shortcomings. Yeah. Those are all aspects of the shadow. So the more I push it into the darkness, the more it's going to be operating autonomously out there. On the other hand, shadow aspects, we are all capable of evil, but our biggest shadow issue is not evil. It's that we live small and adaptive lives. And Jung put it this way in a very homey metaphor. He said, we all walk in shoes too small for us.
That's great.
And I think that was a way of saying, all right, we had to learn early as children. The world's big and you're not. The world's powerful and you're not. Now, how are you going to survive a few decades with that? You better fit in, fella. You better learn adaptive skills. And in doing so, you leave something of your own reality behind. And that's why I say the second half of life is about the recovery of that personal authority. And so the biggest shadow issue for us is how much fear governs our behaviors. If you really dig deeply, remember, it's not about what it's about.
Yeah.
And how often we're serving the sort of archaic messages from long ago and far away, which is walking down the street backwards. And how seldom we step into the largeness of our own journey, because frankly, it's intimidating.
Jung used to, I understand, talked about the gold in the shadow, right, as well.
Yeah, because, for example, just ask yourself the question, where did the natural joy and spontaneity of the child that you were, where did that go? Where's your creativity? Where's this sense of freshness and joy in experiencing life itself? Things get so dulled and so routinized, And as Keats said, habit is the great deadener, And we recognize there that we all have a frightened child in us, but we also have the joyous, creative, spontaneous child in us as well. And that child doesn't show up very often.
I think one of the things that you've said many times, actually, but right at the end, is also of Living Between Worlds, is this always to push yourself to go further and keep going and going mm-hmm. through as the way forth. And I can see that's the way to stay alive, right?
If you're curious, life is never finished. Right? The body declines. Yeah. I'm now 80. Yeah. I'm very much aware of the limits of the body, but I'm still curious. I mean, I love people whom I love, and I want to be here for them, but I'm also curious. There's so much more to learn. So that's the fire inside of each of us. And whenever that is quenched, you're good as dead. Your body might continue, but you died a long time ago.
Yeah. That feels like a good time we're coming up to time. It feels like a good place to end, or I hesitate to even say end now. As I mentioned before we're recording, the show is named after this film by Ray and Charles Eames about the relative size of things in the universe. And, I found it often a very useful thing to reflect on the awesomeness in the proper sense of that word of the universe, because it kind of reminds you not only of, I'm just part of this kind of great thing, but also it puts a lot of major problems that seem really big in your life into perspective. Also reminds you of how little time we have in our lives here. But from that, I often I ask every guest, what one small thing do you think should be considered, reconsidered, maybe overlooked, has an outsized effect, or would have an outsized effect on the world?
Well, I would be concerned, first of all, to have an outsized effect on us. Jung said once in a letter, life is a short pause between two great mysteries. And I think we forget that on a daily basis. And one needs to remember this is a very short pause. And therefore, we have to live it as luminously and as fully as we possibly can. But secondly, we're all swathed in mystery here. I don't want to sound strange about this. It's just, we don't know from whence we come, whither we go. But here you are, choices to make. And as I just mentioned with Emily Dickinson, you better figure out where your real compass is. You had it as a child. It's taken away necessarily by the adaptations to the world around you. And it stays within you because there's always something in you, what you can call the self, with a capital S, not to be confused with the ego state. That is, in a sense, the organic wisdom of the person. And it is always in some way seeking your attention. And what we call, for example, what we call symptoms is not something we try to get rid of. We'd rather ask the question, why have they come? What kind of corrective is being asked for by the self? And how do I need to change my life? So I'm less concerned at this moment about the big picture. I'm concerned about how do you govern your life? How do you navigate in these in-between times in a personal way? Because sooner or later, if you don't take on that accountability, somebody else is going to be doing it for you, or you'll be caught in a series of conditioned reflexes.
It's that taking back of the personal authority is both sort of empowering, but also quite scary, isn't it?
Of course. Yeah, it's very intimidating because it means that until we do that, we're not yet an adult. We may have big bodies and big roles, but to be an adult is, I think we would probably agree, it means to be, I am accountable for my journey. It's a very simple definition, but it's profound in its implication. No one else is. I can't blame anybody else. Fate happens. We have injuries and hurts and things that steer us in one direction or another. But in the end, I'm accountable for this journey, and I'm going to show up in the best way I can.
I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but in the meantime, we're going to have to stop. The people can find you at jameshollis.net. They can find all of your books there and links to your books. There's if not a lifetime, many years of very valuable reading there to be done. There's also, you've got quite a lot of other lecture series and all sorts of things online, haven't you?
Yes.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being my guest on Power of 10.
You're welcome, Andy. It's a good conversation. I enjoyed meeting you. Thank you.
As I'm sure you're aware, you've been listening to Power of 10. My name is Andy Polaine. You can find me at Polaine on Twitter or Polaine.com, where you can find more episodes and sign up for my newsletter, Doctor's Note. If you like the show, please take a moment to give it a rating on iTunes. It really helps others find us. And as always, get in touch if you have any comments, feedback or suggestions for guests. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks for listening and see you next time.